My husband, a celebrated professor of business ethics, had been lecturing on integrity for 30 years. So when I received the photos of him entering a secret apartment with his graduate assistant, I didn't just get angry. I got strategic and set a trap he never saw coming. This is where the story truly begins, and you won't want to miss what happens. Make sure you're subscribed to see it through to the end. We're always curious. Where in the world are you all watching from today? Let us know in the comments. The email arrived on a Tuesday, a day already gray with a persistent, cold drizzle that matched the ache in my bones. I was sitting at our large oak dining table, a place that had hosted decades of family dinners, holiday celebrations, and quiet morning coffees, nursing a cup of herbal tea. The steam warmed my hands, a small comfort against the damp chill that had settled deep within me since my diagnosis a few months prior. The doctor had been optimistic. A manageable condition, he'd called it, but the fatigue was a constant, unwelcome companion, a thief of energy and focus. I was supposed to be reviewing blueprints for the restoration of the old city library, a project that was the culmination of my career as an architectural historian. Instead, I found myself staring out the window, watching the rain blur the vibrant autumn leaves into a watercolor of muted golds and reds. The notification pinged softly on my laptop, an unobtrusive sound that would, in moments, shatter the quiet sanctity of my life. The subject line was blank. The sender was a cryptic string of letters and numbers, the kind the rational mind dismisses as spam. But a prickle of unease, a cold sliver of intuition, made me click it open. There was no text, just 3 attachments, 3 photographs. My breath hitched. The first photo was taken from across a street, slightly grainy, as if captured in haste. It showed a man I knew as well as my own reflection, my husband, Julian, standing before the sleek glass entrance of a modern, unfamiliar apartment building. His distinguished silver hair was unmistakable, as was the tailored tweed jacket I had bought him for his 55th birthday. He was looking over his shoulder, a furtive glance that seemed entirely out of character for the confident, respected university professor he was. The second photo was sharper. He was holding the door open for someone. A young woman, her face turned away from the camera, her long, dark hair swinging as she stepped inside. She was carrying a designer handbag, one I vaguely recognized from a magazine, the kind of extravagant accessory Julian often railed against as a symbol of frivolous consumerism. My heart began to pound a slow, heavy rhythm against my ribs. The third photo was the one that broke me. It was a close-up, taken through the glass of the lobby. Julian was smiling. It was not his usual polite, academic smile, the one he gave to students or colleagues. This was a smile of genuine, unbridled delight, a smile I hadn't seen directed at me in years. His hand was resting on the small of the young woman's back, a gesture of easy intimacy that was both proprietary and tender. The teacup slipped from my numb fingers, shattering on the hardwood floor. Hot liquid splashed across my legs, but I barely felt it. A roaring sound filled my ears, drowning out the gentle patter of the rain. It was the sound of a carefully constructed world collapsing, of 28 years of shared history turning to dust. The man in those photos was a stranger. And yet, he was the man I had built my life with, the man I had loved since we were idealistic college students, the man who held my hand through the birth of our 2 children and the loss of my parents. I sat there for what felt like an eternity, the shards of porcelain at my feet a perfect metaphor for the state of my marriage. The initial shock gave way to a wave of nausea, followed by a cold, hollowing grief. Every shared memory, every promise, every quiet moment of trust was now tainted, rewritten by this new, ugly truth. My illness had made me feel vulnerable, but this was an annihilation of the self. The betrayal was worse than the diagnosis itself. The hours that followed the discovery were a blur of disoriented motion. I cleaned up the broken cup with trembling hands, my movements robotic and detached. My mind, however, was a maelstrom of frantic, agonizing questions. Who was she? How long had this been going on? Who sent the email? The last question echoed with a particular chill. It wasn't a jilted lover seeking revenge, or the sender would have identified themselves. This was different. It felt calculated, a deliberate and anonymous deployment of information. It was a warning, or perhaps a weapon. That evening, Julian called, his voice the same warm, familiar timbre it had always been. "Maeve, darling, I'm so sorry," he began, the practiced apology already on his lips. "The faculty dinner is running dreadfully late. Old Professor Albright is waxing lyrical about university policy again. You know how it is. I'll be another hour or so. Don't wait up." The lie was so effortless, so smooth it was as if he were commenting on the weather. In the past, I would have accepted it without a second thought. I would have pictured him in the stuffy, wood-paneled faculty club, nodding patiently while his elderly colleague droned on. But now all I could see were the photographs. The sleek glass lobby, the expensive handbag, his hand on her back. A cold, hard knot formed in my stomach. "Of course, Julian," I said, my own voice a stranger to me, calm, even betraying none of the chaos raging within. "You know how Albright can be. Drive safely when you do leave." "I will. Love you," he said, a casual sign-off he had used thousands of times. "You too," I replied, the words tasting like ash. I ended the call and sank into an armchair, the silence of the house amplifying the turmoil in my head. He was with her, right now, while I was at home, managing the chronic ache of my condition and the fresh, acute pain of his betrayal. The sheer audacity of it was breathtaking. He was a professor of business ethics. His signature lecture, the one that was always standing room only, was titled The Architecture of Integrity. He built his entire professional identity on the foundations of morality, transparency, and trust. A new feeling began to stir beneath the grief, a slow, simmering anger. It was an unfamiliar emotion for me. I was a restorer of old things, a patient historian who believed in careful preservation. My instinct was always to mend, to understand, to find the original intent and honor it. But this was not a crumbling facade in need of repair. This was a demolition. As I sat there, a thought began to surface, a faint memory from a few years back. It was about our finances. Julian had always managed our investments, claiming I had the more creative mind while he had the head for numbers. I never questioned it. One of our larger joint investment accounts, one I had contributed a significant inheritance to, had supposedly gone bust during a market downturn. Julian had been devastated, or so he had seemed. He presented me with statements, complex charts, and explanations filled with financial jargon I didn't understand. He had seemed so genuinely distraught that I had comforted him, telling him it was only money and that we would be fine. We were a team. Now, sitting in the dark, that memory felt different. The edges were sharper, the details more suspect. The way he had rushed through the explanation, the way he had quickly filed the worthless paperwork away. A quiet, persistent thought echoed in my mind, a line of foreshadowing for the battle to come, but he had forgotten one crucial thing. He had forgotten my profession. He saw me as a gentle academic, lost in the dusty archives of the past. He had forgotten that I am, at my core, a researcher. I don't just look at the surface of a building. I uncover its foundation, I analyze its structure, I find the hidden rot and the secret passages. I knew how to dig. And for the first time in my life, I was going to use my skills not to preserve a history, but to excavate a lie. To understand the depth of the wound, you have to understand the life Julian and I had built. We were a team, a partnership forged in the fires of graduate school, raising two wonderful children and navigating the predictable tempests of life. I had poured everything I was into our family and his career. When his academic pursuits required him to travel for research, I managed the household alone. When his first book was published, I organized the launch party, edited his manuscripts, and was his most ardent champion. I believed in him, not just as my husband, but as a genuinely good man. My inheritance from my parents, a substantial sum I'd received a decade ago, was something we had decided to invest together for our future, for our retirement. It was I who had suggested the joint account, a symbol of our complete and total partnership. It was this fund that Julian had claimed was wiped out in a market collapse. I remember the night he told me, his face a mask of anguish. He'd held me and apologized profusely, and I had reassured him, my heart aching for his pain, for his sense of failure. My devotion made the introduction of the antagonist feel like a particularly cruel twist of the knife. I first met her, Isabella, a few weeks before the email arrived. Julian had brought her to a university fundraising gala. He introduced her as his new graduate assistant, his protégé. She was young, of course, no older than our daughter. She had that effortless, luminous beauty of youth, with wide, dark eyes and a smile that seemed both innocent and knowing. She was dressed in a sleek, minimalist black dress that was far too expensive for a typical graduate student's budget. Isabella is a brilliant mind, Julian had gushed, his hand hovering near her back in a gesture I now recognized from the photograph. Her dissertation is going to revolutionize the field. I extended my hand, offering her a genuine smile. It's a pleasure to meet you, Isabella. Julian has told me so much about your work. He speaks so highly of you too, Maeve, she'd replied, her voice smooth as silk. Her handshake was firm, her gaze direct. There was a polish to her, a carefully constructed poise that felt out of place. Her nails were perfectly manicured, her jewelry subtle but clearly expensive. She spoke about her research with a detached, rehearsed passion, using buzzwords that seemed designed to impress rather than inform. Throughout the evening, I observed her. She hung on Julian's every word, laughing a little too loudly at his jokes, touching his arm lightly as she made a point. It was a masterful performance of adoration, but I also noticed something else. Her eyes, whenever she thought no one was looking, would scan the room with a cool, appraising quality. She wasn't just looking at the people, she was assessing them. I saw her glance at the diamond earrings on the dean's wife, her eyes lingering for a moment on the Rolex watch worn by a wealthy donor. Her interest wasn't in academia, it was in assets. At one point, while Julian was speaking with a colleague, she turned to me. "This old building is magnificent," she said, gesturing vaguely at the Gothic revival hall we were in. "It must be wonderful to be surrounded by so much history." "It's my life's work," I said, my passion for the subject rising. "This hall, for instance, has a fascinating story. The truss system was considered revolutionary for its time." I stopped. Her eyes had glazed over. She was smiling politely, but she wasn't listening. Her gaze had drifted to a portrait of the university's founder, noting the ornate, gilded frame. "Julian tells me you own a lovely home," she said, abruptly changing the subject. "A historic property, isn't it?" The question was so pointed, so out of context, that it caught me off guard. "Yes," I said slowly. "It's a Victorian house we've restored over the years." "That sounds wonderful," she murmured, her smile widening. "A lot of work, I imagine, but a valuable asset." The word hung in the air between us, asset. She hadn't asked about its character, its history, or the love we had poured into it. She had assessed its value. The chill I'd felt then returned to me now, tenfold. She wasn't just a young woman infatuated with her professor. She was an opportunist. And my husband, the great moral philosopher, was her willing, foolish mark. Or perhaps he was something far worse, her partner. For 2 days, I existed in a state of suspended animation, the grief and anger warring within me, leaving me paralyzed. Then, on Friday morning, something shifted. I was staring at my reflection in the bathroom mirror, at the pale face and the dark circles under my eyes. I looked tired. I looked like a victim. And I decided in that moment that I would not be one. The historian in me took over, the part of my brain that craved order, evidence, and timelines. Grief was a fog, but a plan was a map. My first call was to a man named David Chen. He was the brother of a colleague, a private investigator who was known for his absolute discretion and his bulldog-like tenacity. I met him in a quiet coffee shop on the other side of town. He was a small, unassuming man in his late 40s, with kind eyes that missed nothing. I told him everything, my voice steady as I recounted the email, the photos, and my suspicions. I slid a printed copy of the third photograph across the table. He studied it for a long moment, his expression unreadable. "The metadata from the original email would be helpful," he said. It might tell us where it was sent from. My second call was to a forensic accountant named Sarah Jenkins. She was a legend in her field, a woman who could make numbers sing and balance sheets confess their sins. I explained the situation, the failed investment, my husband's sudden vagueness about our finances. "It's a classic story, Mrs. Vance," she said, her voice crisp and professional. "You'd be amazed how often a midlife crisis is funded by a joint account. I'll need you to quietly gather any financial statements you can find. Old tax returns, bank records, anything you can get your hands on without raising suspicion." This was the clever trap, the leverage I had that Julian had so foolishly underestimated. He thought he controlled the finances, but he had forgotten that I was the one who kept the records. For nearly 30 years, I was the one who filed away every tax return, every bank statement, every piece of official correspondence in meticulously organized boxes in our home office. He called it my hoarding tendency. I called it prudent archiving. It was my professional skill set, applied to our domestic fee, and it was about to become his undoing. That weekend, while Julian was away at a faculty retreat, a lie I now saw with perfect clarity, I descended into the basement office. Box after box, I opened the files, the crisp scent of old paper filling the air. I found the statements for the investment account. I found the documents Julian had given me to show its collapse. And then I found something else. A bank statement from 6 months after the supposed collapse, showing a large wire transfer from a holding company I'd never heard of into Julian's personal account. The amount was almost exactly 1/3 of the initial value of our lost investment. My hands shook as I scanned the document. It was the beginning of a trail. For the rest of the weekend, fueled by coffee and a cold, clear rage, I became an investigator in my own life. I cross-referenced dates and bank transfers. I used my university library access to run deep background checks on Isabella, whose real name, I discovered, was not Isabella Rossi, but Isabella Reed. She had a history of attaching herself to wealthy, older men, followed by messy breakups and quiet settlements. She had no discernible family money, yet her social media footprint, though carefully curated, hinted at a lifestyle far beyond the means of a graduate student. By Monday morning, when David Chen called, I was ready. "I have something on the email," he said. It was sent from a disposable account, but the IP address originated from a public Wi-Fi hotspot. A cafe, to be specific. "The thing is, it's right across the street from the apartment building in the photos." "He was set up," I whispered. "Looks like it," David confirmed. "Someone wanted you to know, and they wanted to do it without getting their own hands dirty. I'm also looking into the girl, Isabella. There's more to her than meets the eye." "I know," I said, looking at the mountain of financial documents spread across my desk. "There's more to him, too." The trap was now set. All I had to do was wait for the right moment to spring it. The opportunity presented itself a week later. Julian came home one evening in a state of high agitation. He paced the living room, running his hands through his hair, his usual academic calm completely gone. He was ranting about a university budget cut that had put the funding for his department's new research wing in jeopardy. "It's a disaster, Maeve," he exclaimed, pouring himself a large glass of scotch. "Years of planning, all down the drain because of some number-crunching bureaucrat." I watched him, my expression one of carefully practiced sympathy. "That's terrible, darling," I said softly. "Is there anything I can do?" He sighed dramatically. "No, unless you have a spare $500,000 lying around." He laughed, a short, bitter sound. "The irony is, if our big investment hadn't gone south all those years ago, I could have funded the initial grant myself. I could have been the hero." The opening was perfect. It was as if he had handed me a scripted cue. I let the silence hang in the air for a moment before I spoke, my voice quiet but laced with steel. "You mean the inheritance from my parents, Julian?" He looked up, surprised by my tone. "Well, yes, our money, it's a shame, but that's the market for you, unpredictable." "Is it?" I asked. I stood up and walked over to the antique secretary desk in the corner of the room. I unlocked a drawer and pulled out a single folder. Because I was looking through some old paperwork the other day. It's funny, the things you forget. For an investment that went bust, it certainly seemed to have a rather healthy afterlife. I opened the folder and slid a single piece of paper onto the coffee table in front of him. It was the bank statement I had found, the one showing the large deposit into his personal account from the unknown holding company. He stared at it, the color drained from his face. For a moment, he was utterly still, his eyes wide with shock. He looked up at me, his mouth opening and closing, but no words came out. The brilliant, articulate professor was speechless. I don't know what that is," he finally stammered, his hand trembling as he reached for the paper. "It must be some kind of mistake." "Is it?" I pressed, my voice still deceptively calm. "Because I found several more. Deposits, Julian, over the course of a year, totaling nearly the full amount of our lost investment. The money wasn't lost at all, was it? You just moved it. You hid it from me." He sprang to his feet, his face contorted with a mixture of fear and rage. "This is insane. You've been spying on me, going through my things." "They are my things too," I countered, my voice rising for the first time. "It was my inheritance, my parents' legacy. Where is the money, Julian?" He began to bluster, to deny, throwing out a flurry of poorly constructed lies and accusations. "This is absurd. You're being paranoid. It's your illness. It's making you delusional." The moment he said it, he knew he had made a mistake. The cruelty of the accusation, using my physical vulnerability against me, hung in the air between us, ugly and unforgivable. "My illness has made me tired, Julian," I said, my voice dropping to a near whisper, each word precise and cold. "It has not made me stupid." Just then, his phone, which he had left on the mantel, buzzed with an incoming text. The screen lit up. The name on the notification was Isabella. The message was a single sentence. "Did you get the funds for the down payment yet, honey?" I pointed to the phone. "Is that another mistake, Julian? Or is she part of the investment strategy too?" The fight went out of him completely. He stared at the phone, then at me, his expression one of pure, unadulterated panic. His carefully constructed world, his image as a man of integrity, was shattering before his eyes. He tried to speak, but all that came out was a choked, desperate sound. The great orator, the man who held lecture halls captive with his eloquence, had run out of lies. The first part of the trap had been sprung, and he had walked right into it. Julian's immediate reaction was to retreat into a sullen, wounded silence. He attempted to paint me as the villain, a suspicious, paranoid wife who had violated his privacy. He alternated between pathetic apologies and indignant accusations. He even tried to defend Isabella, casting her as an innocent young student who was being unfairly maligned. He claimed the money was a loan he was managing for a friend, a story so flimsy it was insulting. But the panic in his eyes told me everything I needed to know. He was desperate. His desperation made him sloppy. He started making frantic phone calls in hushed tones, shutting himself in his study for hours. He didn't know that David Chen, my investigator, was already 2 steps ahead of him. David's work was methodical and brilliant. He had uncovered that the apartment from the photos was not rented, but in the process of being purchased. The down payment, as Isabella's text message had so conveniently revealed, was imminent. The funds were being drawn from a new bank account Julian had opened, an account funded by the very lost inheritance he had systematically siphoned off years ago. Meanwhile, Sarah Jenkins, the forensic accountant, had pieced together the entire sordid puzzle. Julian had used a shell corporation, registered to a post office box, to purchase the worthless stocks from our joint account, effectively selling our assets to himself for pennies on the dollar. He then liquidated the assets into his own hidden accounts. It was a sophisticated, deeply malicious fraud, perpetrated against his own wife. The most damning revelation, however, came from David. His investigation into Isabella Reed had turned up a former victim, a retired surgeon from another city who had been charmed by a brilliant young art history student. The The story was eerily similar: a whirlwind romance, lavish gifts, and a sudden investment opportunity that had cost the man his life savings. The surgeon, humiliated and heartbroken, had never pressed charges, but he was willing to talk. He had documents, old love letters filled with promises and requests for money, all signed by the same woman. The stakes escalated when Julian, in a desperate attempt to regain control, tried to block my access to our remaining joint bank accounts. He told me it was a precaution, that my erratic behavior had forced his hand. It was a foolish, transparently panicked move. It was also the final piece of evidence I needed. I arranged the second confrontation carefully. I asked Julian to meet me at our lawyer's office, under the pretense of discussing a path toward reconciliation. He arrived looking wary, but also slightly smug, as if he believed he still held the upper hand. He probably assumed I was there to capitulate, to be soothed by legal jargon and empty promises. He walked into the conference room and stopped dead. Sitting at the table next to me and my lawyer was a distinguished, white-haired gentleman. It was the retired surgeon. On the table, laid out in neat piles, were Sarah Jenkins's forensic accounting report, a transcript of David Chen's interview with the surgeon, and copies of the love letters Isabella had written to her previous mark. "Julian," I said, my voice devoid of all emotion, "I'd like you to meet Dr. Alastair Finch. I believe you have something in common. You've both been a victim of a very clever, very convincing young woman. The only difference is, Dr. Finch didn't pay for her apartment with his wife's inheritance." Julian stared at the surgeon, then at the documents on the table. The blood drained from his face, leaving behind a pasty, gray mask of terror. He understood in that instant that this was not a negotiation. It was an execution. The district attorney's office finds fraud cases particularly interesting, my lawyer said, her tone conversational, especially when they involve respected university professors and vulnerable, elderly victims. It makes for such compelling headlines. Julian crumpled into a chair, his body seeming to shrink. The spell was broken. There was no more blustering, no more denial. There was only the stark, irrefutable proof of his crimes, laid out on a polished mahogany table. The antagonist's grand performance was over, and the only thing left was the pathetic man behind the curtain. The perfect stage for the final act was an event Julian himself had orchestrated, a lavish dinner party at our home to celebrate the publication of his latest book, The Moral Compass, Navigating the Ethical Landscape. It was the pinnacle of his hypocrisy, a monument to his own delusion. He had been forced to go through with it. Canceling would have raised too many questions among his colleagues and the university elite. He had spent the week since our meeting at the lawyer's office in a state of terrified compliance, moving through our home like a ghost, his eyes hollow with the knowledge of his impending doom. The guests began to arrive, a collection of academics, donors, and university deans, all eager to congratulate the man of the hour. The house buzzed with polite conversation and the clinking of wine glasses. And then, Isabella arrived. Julian had obviously been unable to prevent her from coming. She swept in wearing a stunning crimson dress, a triumphant smile on her face, completely oblivious to the fact that she was walking into an ambush. She greeted Julian with a familiar touch on the arm, positioning herself as the hostess's heir apparent. I watched from the sidelines, a picture of quiet grace in a simple navy blue dress, greeting guests with a serene smile. Many of them offered me their sympathies for my recent illness, a narrative Julian had clearly been spinning to explain my supposed fragility. After the main course, Julian stood to give a toast. He raised his glass, his hand trembling slightly, and began to speak about the importance of integrity, of living an authentic life. The irony was so thick it was almost suffocating. He thanked his colleagues, the university, and then he turned to me. "And finally," he said, his voice cracking with false emotion, "I want to thank my dear wife, Maeve. Her unwavering support has been the bedrock of my life. Through sickness and in health, she has been my moral compass." The room filled with appreciative murmurs. This was my cue. I remained seated, waiting for the applause to die down. Then, I gently tapped my water glass with a spoon. A hush fell over the room. "Thank you, Julian," I said, my voice clear and steady, carrying to every corner of the dining room. "That's a beautiful sentiment, and it reminds me that I also have a few people to thank." I stood up, holding a small stack of papers. "First, I'd like to thank Dr. Alastair Finch, who unfortunately couldn't be here tonight, for sharing his own cautionary tale about the high cost of youthful exuberance." I glanced at Isabella, whose smile had frozen on her face. "I'd also like to thank the skilled professionals who can uncover the truth, even when it's buried under years of deception. People like forensic accountants who can follow a trail of stolen money, even when it's cleverly hidden in shell corporations." Julian's face was now as white as the tablecloth. The guests were looking back and forth between us, a confused, intrigued buzz filling the room. "You see," I continued, my gaze locking onto Julian, "my husband's book is about a moral compass. But it seems his own compass has been broken for quite some time. It led him to steal his wife's inheritance, the money her parents left her, to fund a secret life." I paused, letting the words sink in. A life that included purchasing a luxury apartment for his protégé. I turned my attention fully to Isabella. "Miss Reed," I said, using her real name, "a word of advice. When you're committing fraud, it's best not to use the same playbook twice. Dr. Finch recognized your handwriting immediately." Isabella shot to her feet, her face a mask of fury. "This is insane. She's a bitter, sick old woman." "Am I?" I replied calmly. Then I did something no one expected. I smiled. A genuine, triumphant smile. "Perhaps, but I am also a very wealthy woman. Or at least I will be once the assets Julian stole from me are returned, which according to this court order they will be." I placed a document on the table. It was a court-ordered asset freeze. "Which brings me to my final thank you," I said, my voice ringing with finality. "To my husband, Julian, thank you for teaching me the most valuable lesson of all, that the most impressive facades often hide the most rotten foundations." The silence was absolute. Then, Isabella, realizing in an instant that her golden goose was not just cooked but bankrupt, turned on Julian Y. A snarl. "You told me the money was yours, you liar!" She grabbed her purse and stormed out of the house, leaving a stunned and humiliated Julian standing alone in the ruins of his life. The public showdown was over. His career was finished. His reputation was destroyed, and I had never felt more at peace. The aftermath was swift and decisive. Julian's downfall was as spectacular as his rise had been. The university, faced with a brewing scandal involving fraud and a predatory professor, quickly distanced itself. He was suspended, then quietly forced into early retirement. His book was pulled from publication. The social shunning was absolute. Colleagues crossed the street to avoid him, and the invitations that had once filled our mailbox ceased entirely. He was a pariah, a living embodiment of the hypocrisy he had preached against. Our divorce was uncontested. Faced with the mountain of evidence, Julian had no choice but to agree to my terms. The full amount of my inheritance, adjusted for years of market growth, was returned to me. I got the house, the remaining shared assets, and my freedom. The last time I saw him, he was packing his books into cardboard boxes, a stooped, gray man who looked 10 years older. He tried to apologize, to explain, but the words were empty. I simply nodded and walked away, feeling not hatred, but a profound and final indifference. Isabella vanished. With her source of funding gone and her reputation in tatters, she dropped out of the university and disappeared. David later told me she had moved to another state, likely in search of a new mark. But her name was now on the radar of law enforcement, a ghost that would follow her. Justice, in its own way, had been served. With the legal battles behind me, I turned my energy toward healing, both physically and emotionally. My health stabilized. The constant stress had exacerbated my condition, and with Julian gone, a sense of peace settled over me, which proved to be the best medicine of all. The house, once a site of betrayal, was now my sanctuary, filled with light and quiet purpose. My children, who were horrified by their father's actions, rallied around me with fierce love and support. My greatest source of joy, however, was the library restoration. With a portion of my reclaimed funds, I established a foundation to oversee the project, ensuring its completion. I spent my days on scaffolding, consulting with artisans, and poring over original blueprints. I was no longer just preserving history, I was building a future, creating a space for knowledge, community, and quiet contemplation. One sunny afternoon, months later, I was standing in the library's grand reading room, the sunlight streaming through the newly restored stained glass windows, painting the floor in jewels of color. My daughter came to meet me for lunch. She put her arm around my waist, and we stood together in silence, admiring the work. "He called, you know," she said quietly. "Dad, he sounds lost." I nodded, looking up at the intricate woodwork on the ceiling. "He is," I said. "He built his life on a lie, and the foundation finally gave way." "Are you okay, Mom?" she asked, her voice filled with concern. I turned to her and smiled, a real smile, one that reached my eyes and filled them with a light I thought I had lost forever. "I'm more than okay," I said. "I'm free." The antagonist was gone, the conflict was resolved, and my life, like the beautiful old building around me, had been meticulously, lovingly restored. I had found my peace, not in revenge, but in reclamation.